Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Just a practical and useful piece of information. We're holding on a little because more chairs need to be brought into the room. So if you will have patience for a couple of more minutes, that's very good. And those at the back of the room will be generously rewarded for their patience. Good morning, everyone. Could I just check if the sound is okay at the end of the room? Good. So I welcome you all on behalf of the expert panel on innovative climate finance. And I thank the 6 humanitarian organizations here present for the challenge. These organizations and their international colleagues are really at the battlefront of the climate crisis, the disasters, the refugee flows, the conflicts, and the resulting long-term undermining of economic and social developments, justice and human rights. Let me take you back to when I first had direct contact with these organizations present today. It was 1985, and I was active in the Norwegian TV fundraiser, which Norwegian youth organizations organized. I realize 1985 is a while ago. The big issue of the day was the drought in Ethiopia, and we got used to images like this. Except this image is not Africa. It's Spain, 2022. It could have been Lake Mead in Nevada. It could have been China, but it's now. These and other climate disasters are really expensive. The Spanish one, only for losses in the Spanish agricultural sector last year, amounted to 10 billion euros in one country, one sector, 1 year. Climate action is costly, but climate change is costlier. And the development challenges will not only persist, they will grow in the face of climate change. That's why we need to safeguard budgets for fighting poverty. At the same time, we need to scale up climate action because climate change is also a mass producer of poverty. The need for climate finance is way bigger than our traditional notions of traditional aid. We're talking about a range of 10 times the current global aid levels. That also means that the $100 billion that are referred to within the climate negotiations and that are really important for trust levels of those negotiations, they're nowhere near what is needed. Based on estimates by world-leading economists, the climate finance need for emerging markets and developing economies, except China, is roughly $2,400 billion annually by 2030. It's a lot of money. Now, these countries can finance more than half of this themselves. It's a quite often overlooked fact. So the need for external finance is roughly $1,000 billion. Still a lot of money. Most of this can actually be mobilized through private sources. The biggest chunk of the overall climate finance need is for mitigation, for cutting emissions. And you can actually make a revenue, a profit, from a solar park or a wind park or other emission-cutting activities. And that obviously makes for private investment. 8 out of $10 invested in mitigation activities in the rich part of the world comes from private sources, 81%. In poor countries, that number is 14%. And the big challenge, therefore, is to help developing economies mobilize more. Africa, for example, has 60% of the global solar energy potential, but investments have gone down over the last few years in solar power. And that's a situation we simply can't have. There are two main reasons for that reduction. One is the political and currency risk, the cost of capital. If you plan to set up a solar plant in Norway, if the cost of capital is 3-4%, in South Africa, the exact same endeavor would be 12%. There's also a pipeline issue, a lack of good project development and regulatory weaknesses in a number of countries. The good news is these things can be fixed. Climate adaptation is a different category. We need to adapt to the unfolding climate change. Climate adaptation saves you money. If you build flood walls like this in the Philippines, you save money for the future. And that's why climate adaptation lends itself to loans, concessional loans on good, beneficial conditions. Because the debt crisis is already big and growing, this financing needs to be structured so that developing countries avoid accumulating new debt problems. And certain adaptation solutions, for example in land, forest, and ocean, can have mitigation results as well, and therefore have a potential for private sector investment. But largely, this has to be public funding, not least loans. Loss and damage, such as after the floods in Pakistan, must be financed primarily by public funding, preferably through global or regional funding mechanisms. Loss and damage is a fundamental justice issue. Poor countries have a very small share historically of global emissions. This is changing now, but it's a key issue that they should, weak as they are financially, not bear the brunt of the loss and damage. Climate change hits poor countries the hardest. They're the least responsible for it. And therefore, it's an imperative that in the climate transition, we have a fair, just, human rights-based financing for loss and damage. And we need to find it also because otherwise climate negotiations are going to be blocked for years to come. Now, those $1,000 billion in external finance that is needed by 2030 on an annual basis is a lot of money. It's roughly the combined wealth of the 8 wealthiest individuals on the planet. If we compare to the health budgets during the pandemic, they were 9 times higher than that amount. So yes, it's big money, but it's an amount of money that is possible to mobilize. Again, much of it from private investment. As a global community, we have the solutions in the fight against climate change. There is so much technological innovation, there is so much financial innovation, and money is around. What we really need is political innovation. And we do think, as an expert group, that Norway is well positioned to be the political innovation leader that the world needs. Norway can't act on its own. We're not suggesting that it should, but we do profoundly believe that Norway can lead, and we are suggesting it should. We do believe that a coalition of willing contributors is needed to mobilize the necessary global financing, and that Norway should take the lead in establishing such a coalition. In the current geopolitical situation, which is really, really difficult, we also believe that a smallish country, but financially big country with credibility and resources is particularly well placed to take such leadership. The expert group presents some very concrete opportunities for Norwegian leadership. We emphasize climate and environmental integrity. We emphasize human rights and justice integrity, but we also do emphasize integrity of Norwegian financial management. Our proposals are within the framework and guidelines for the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We're pointing, for example, in the report, to the considerable financial flexibility and economic flexibility and space that exists within the 3% trajectory of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So to our proposals, first we propose a new global scheme called Global Green Guarantees. The OECD points to guarantees as the most effective way of mobilizing private capital. If you look at the multilateral development banks, their guarantees mobilize 5 to 6 times more private capital than loans and equity. What we're proposing is that Norway initiates a coalition of willing countries to trigger considerable private sector investments in renewable energy and natural capital, a Global Green Guarantee initiative. We propose that this initiative builds on unfunded guarantees, meaning state guarantees by the Norwegian state. This means there's a very small need for liquidity, meaning budgetary expenditure upfront. You need a provision for loss. You need some allocations for project development, some level of subsidy, but you can have a much bigger guarantee exposure, and in that way mobilize considerable private capital. This is an example, and obviously working with these numbers, you need to be careful, but if you have a guarantee exposure not on the budget of 20 billion US dollars, you can have 1 to 1.3 billion of grant funding, and you'll be able to mobilize 30 billion dollars in private capital. And this is based on evidence from existing guarantee mechanisms. We have, as an expert group, had considerable support and help from the Blended Finance Task Force and Systemic, which is a group working on these issues, and they have presented also a report on guarantees specifically. They're the ones who have drawn up these models for us. They're going to have a deep dive into these issues later today, and that separate report will provide more information on how this could be done. Sweden has a similar model, much smaller, not only relating to climate investments, but a model that should inspire us. Their guarantee exposure is 1 billion. They've mobilized 2.7 billion US dollars in private and public capital on top of that, with, as you can see from these smaller amounts, very small actual costs for budgets and taxpayers. Norway has, as one of about 12 countries, I think, globally, a AAA rating. We have a very solid financial basis and a financial muscle that can, without public expenditure as such, be a very important force behind scaling up global climate finance. And we do believe and suggest that Norway should launch a considerable first effort and then ask and invite other countries to join with a pledge that if they join, Norway would beef up even more. Because getting other countries on board is essential. G7, G20, our Nordic neighbors and European neighbors, and for example, a country like the United Arab Emirates, which has, much like Norway, had a considerable oil and gas revenue windfall over the last couple of years. Plus, they're hosting the COP this autumn. So there should be incentives for doing good stuff. And we believe Norway could really be part of that incentivization process. We're also moving on to another important area. We're suggesting a new climate deal for multilateral development banks. World Bank and regional development banks are a good platform for scaling up climate finance, and especially for adaptation, because they do have a broad development mandate, and adaptation is a lot about long-term development. And the banks are able to combine concessional loans with aid. Now, MDBs already act on climate, but there are important ongoing discussions to strengthen their climate efforts, not least of the World Bank. A general capital increase of the World Bank is hard to achieve. China is more than willing to increase its capital of the World Bank if they get voting rights in return. And you can imagine where that discussion ends. What Norway could do is, firstly, as an owner, to extend guarantees for the World Bank capital, and that guarantee mechanism can also be designed to backstop multilateral development banks. Another option is to increase the capital through a voluntary capital injection, but contingent on a commitment for more efficiency and more emphasis on climate action of the World Bank. Actually, a capital increase of the World Bank of $9 billion US, 90 billion Norwegian kroner, would double the available capital of the bank and significantly improve its lending opportunities. Again, Norway could go first in shaping a coalition. Another important role for those multilateral development banks is to address those regulatory hurdles, the poor tax models, the monopolies, etc., that are blocking investments in climate solutions in a number of countries. Those issues are better addressed by a multilateral agency than by a bilateral donor. We're also suggesting that Norway should support the considerable dynamic and momentum of the Bridgetown initiative and channel its special drawing rights in the IMF into climate finance. This is a complicated issue. You can read more about it in the report. The Bridgetown initiative is spearheaded by this woman, Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and she and President Macron will have a climate finance summit in Paris in June. We believe Norway has a lot of potential in our report to come up with good stuff for that summit. Then we have Norwegian instruments. We believe we have and should have a possibility and should strengthen those instruments as well, including a faster capitalization of the Climate Investment Fund. I have to state my conflict of interest in being a board member of the Climate Investment Fund, and therefore I'll also say that I was keeping a low profile in the discussions about this issue. But the Climate Investment Fund should be faster capitalized. And we also believe in moving the government pensions fund mandate on unlisted infrastructure for renewable energy to a separate fund, NBIM Renewable. The fund has, the NBIM has a mandate to invest up to 2% of investment in unlisted infrastructure in OECD countries. We believe that in order to better deliver on that mandate and possibly extend beyond OECD countries, there would be merits in organizing this within the fund, but as a separate construction, because that could enable broader geographical scope, somewhat higher risk level without compromising the general risk level of NBIM as a whole. The Climate Investment Fund has a mandate to make investments that would otherwise not take place, in other words, that have additionality. And the potential of the fund to facilitate much more such projects is limited by the total capital and the trajectory of likely future capital increases. With more capital, the Climate Investment Fund could engage more robustly in national energy transition processes and expand to more countries. So we recommend also a considerable capital injection for the Climate Investment Fund. And we do recommend that the government establishes an independent expert group to assess the current volume of the fund's provisions for loss and to consider more efficient mechanisms. Finally, we have looked at the global climate funds under the UNFCCC. We encourage Norway to be willing to step up finance for these funds, provided that they are efficient and effective. We prefer these funds to have global financing channels, drawing on or building on the polluter pays principle. We believe Norway should drive the issue of a globally applicable tax on shipping and air transport, and to be willing to channel such funds into the global funds under the Climate Convention. But we also do appreciate that this is an extremely slow-moving process. The IMO has agreed on the principle of climate taxes on emissions by 2030, and still haven't agreed on in which ways and for what purposes. So we propose taking regional approaches, starting with the region that is the most forward-leaning in this area, Europe. And we do believe that action on the loss and damage fund, that is still under negotiation, is particularly important to avoid progress in climate negotiations being hijacked by polarization in the coming years. Specifically, we think Norway should propose a European initiative for loss and damage. And we do recommend that Norway should team up with the EU in being part of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the mechanism that will put a climate tax on imported goods from countries that don't have carbon taxes, and that a share of the revenue of that model should be earmarked for loss and damage. Currently, it's earmarked for EU activities, but as a minimum, Norway could put up a proposal that if Norway join and other EFTA countries join, their share at least could be allocated and earmarked for loss and damage. We have been able previously to get special arrangements around the European the ETS, the cap and trade system of the European Union. We can be able to do such trading again. So those are the major recommendations of our group. Many of which can have an outsized impact compared to the expenditure we're talking about. They are politically doable. We have put a lot of emphasis on trying to be concrete, specific, and build on best available international expertise in designing good solutions. I would like to thank the expert group for having done a fantastic teamwork in a record short period of time. Likewise, the Secretariat, even more impressive teamwork. Some would say work challenged by modern slavery legislation. And I would like to thank the many that have engaged in this process, including from international quarters. This is a group established by Norwegian NGOs. It's nothing to do with Norwegian authorities, but there's been such an interest by international actors in this. Mia Mottley's key advisor on the Bridgetown initiative. I've had 2 long phone calls with the incoming president of the World Bank because he's looking for ideas and he has a profound belief that if things are moving in Norway, that is really promising. And a lot of other actors internationally taking a keen interest in what Norway can do. And then not least, I mentioned Systemic and the Blended Finance Task Force that really has done tremendous supporting work, including interviewing Norwegian business leaders and others in looking at not least the guarantee model. So we believe that the Norwegian government should lead. We've spoken with many who share this opinion. That includes Norwegian business leaders, international experts, opinion leaders. It's quite clear that Norway will be remembered in future for having beefed up investments in oil and gas when not only climate reports are coming, but climate change is happening. That's a fact. But we can also be remembered for making good use of that wealth derived from those resources to really launch something that could get others on board in raising those trillions that are needed. We believe no one is better placed to take on this leadership, and that's why we're asking, if not Norway, who? And to our taskmasters, the 6 humanitarian organizations, we do also propose that you lead. You have international networks, you have sister organizations, and you should work with your sister organizations to mobilize their respective governments to the coalition we're calling for. The Norwegian Red Cross could work with to take an example by chance, the Emirati Red Crescent, for example, to try to create a groundswell of opinion for improving climate finance. And I'm happy to invite Dagfinn Høybråten on behalf of the 6 organizations to receive 6 copies of the report.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vidar Helgesen, and a big thank you to the expert groups. A considerable amount of work has been put into this report, and many use their time to bring the debate about how Norway can take international leadership in climate finance forward. As humanitarian organizations, development organizations, we see every day the challenge on the ground. And we have felt over time a need to challenge the thinking around climate finance, because so far solutions and ambitions have been totally insufficient. It's about justice, it's about Norway's fair share, it's about leadership in a time of multiple crises. So the expert committee has had a dialogue with several of the leading national and international experts in this field, as we heard, and there is therefore a depth and a weight to this report that will set the tone for the debate in the years to come, I'm convinced. As organizations behind this initiative, we will now study the report with great interest, but we hope that the signals put forward here will inspire the government, the parliament, the private sector, and to think outside the box, to think new, to think innovatively, much bigger about the opportunity that Norway now has to take international leadership. We are in a special time in Europe and the world, which leads to large involuntary additional income for Norway. Therefore, there are many who are now looking to Norway for its leadership. And you might argue, if not Norway, then who? And I would add, if not now, then when? Because opportunity knocks on Norway's door. So there is an opportunity now to act in other terms and in other ways and with other ambitions. I think the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Nothing is more powerful than ideas which time has come, says Victor Hugo, and I will use his words in characterizing the weight of this report. There are solutions that is for this time, for a time such as this. So with these words, again, a big thank you to the expert group. And if I may add, if I had been politically responsible these days, I would really appreciate it, a gift like this.
Thank you, Dagfinn. Your law on banning smoking indoors in Norway was really controversial at the time, no longer. Just mentioning it as a sign of political courage. I mentioned international experts. We've had lots of them in the process, but we have 2 of them here today. We were supposed to have 3 of them. Regrettably, Franny Leutier had a temperature before boarding the flight yesterday. And these days, you can't board flights if that's your condition. But we do have Johan Rockström and Nigel Topping, and I'm very pleased to introduce one of the world's, I could say, the world's leading, at least most important climate scientist, given that Time magazine has recently referred to him as one of the 100 most influential bodies on the planet. Johan.
Tack Vidar. Good morning everyone. So I wanted to provide you a bit with the scientific framing of this incredibly important initiative that suggests a transitional, transformative climate finance initiative to really implement what Vera Songwe and Nicholas Stern, 2 of our leading climate economists in the world, translated that into the 2,400 billion US dollars per year required if we are to have any chance of delivering on the Paris Agreement. Now, my key message here this morning is what science tells now very clear. We're losing 1.5, but at the same time, we need to hold on to 1.5 with everything we've got. And that is the challenge right now. We are at a very, very delicate, challenging juncture. And the reason for this is that the numbers that Vidar gave us on the impacts we're seeing, 2022 being a record year, the total bill globally is actually estimated to in the order of 330 billion US dollars on climate impacts when you go beyond just Spain, but all the fires, heat waves, droughts, impacts on both health, agriculture sectors, economic damage, and human misery across the world. Now, this is while we're still in a manageable state. This is the planet at 1.2 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise. The dilemma is that more and more science shows that we're reaching limits of adaptation. We're reaching points of potential social collapse. We're reaching points where even money won't take us out of the impacts. That is why 1.5 degrees Celsius is today scientifically, verified also by the IPCC, not some kind of goal or target or negotiated, potentially even number that you can compromise with. It's a limit. It's a physical limit. We published just 6 months back the first quantitative synthesis of tipping elements across the entire planet, showing that 5 of the big biophysical systems that regulates the whole climate system, that we all depend on collectively, with massive impacts against hundreds of millions of people's livelihood if we cross those tipping points, will likely be passed at 1.5. And these are the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet. I mean, dear friends, this is 10 meter sea level rise just held in these 2 systems. All tropical coral reef systems, hosts and livelihoods of over 150 million people across the world already today, and abrupt thawing of permafrost in the boreal zone, just up in the Arctic parts of Norway and Siberia. Now, these are pieces of evidence that just shows the urgency. But the dilemma is that to be able to hold 1.5 degrees Celsius, the remaining global carbon budget is less than 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide. We emit 40 per year, gives us roughly 7.5 years. That's why you start seeing these very dramatic numbers. We have less than 100 months for a safe landing for humanity on Earth. This is the charge. Now, in that charge, we're not making success. We're still continuing to raise emissions. This is a very paradoxical and quite schizophrenic situation, because on the one hand, we have so many positive stories. We're for the first time seeing the exponential rise of solutions. They're scalable, and we're starting to come to double-digit numbers on renewable energy systems across the world. And not only that, as Vidar points out correctly, in mature markets, these systems compete even without subsidies. You just have triple rating on your risk management, on finance, and you can actually make money out of investing in offshore wind or solar panels or biomass and hydro and technologies, innovations that are fossil fuel free. This is a money maker and a path to success. It's just that it doesn't work for the big emerging economies that in the end have caused least but will determine the outcome in the future. It is in the hands of India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil, China, South Africa, the big emerging economies that in the end will determine whether or not we can stay within this very minute global carbon budget. That's why we need to unleash new ways of staying on exponential curves. Now, the emission reduction pathway we need to follow, is 6 to 7% global emission reductions per year. Now, what is 6 to 7% per year? Well, to begin with, it's the limit of what science says is feasible. Go beyond that, and we basically have to start bulldozing infrastructure of energy provision in the world today. So if you want to have an orderly phase out, if we want to have an orderly landing in this turbulent transition phase, where we all know there will be winners in the other end, we need to move fast so that number does not increase even further. Nobody has ever seen transformations at a 10% per year transformative rate. I mean, just to give you one example, the Green Revolution, the last time we had an exponential change and lifting large parts of Southeast Asia from imminent hunger, food yield levels increased by 2% per year. That's what we called a revolution, the agricultural revolution, the Green Revolution. Now we need to have a pace of 6 to 7% per year, 3 times faster. This is why we need all hands on deck, and this is why climate finance is so incredibly important. Europe in this context is, unfortunately, the only world-leading economic region we have. Here are the most mature economies, and the political leadership and the business leadership and civil society engagement that really is moving along the pathway required. Not yet at the pace really needed, but still showing a leadership which takes the world in the right direction. And it's in this context that Norway plays such an important role, because Norway is centrally placed at a position where it has respect in the world, where it can show the positive outcomes of a sustainable, environmentally aligned political and societal development pathway, and still, as Vida points out, has the capital strength to be able to play an important role in leading the way on climate finance. Just to add, finally, to this number game here, because I fully agree with Vida that 1,000 billion US dollars per year may sound like a large number. This is $1 trillion US dollars. It's in the end, a bit more than 1% of global GDP. The total number is in the order of 3% of global GDP required for this transition in developing countries. But it's not only that these numbers are way outpaced, for example, in the COVID recovery investments, but just the report this morning from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute showing that in 2022, the investments in weapons across the world is 2,400 billion US dollars. It just happens to be exactly the same number as Vera Songwe and Nick Stern pointed out is necessary to solve the climate crisis in the developing world. A coincidence, but it just shows that orders of magnitude. Put the money we're now putting on war to save and stabilize the climate on planet Earth, and we actually have a good chance of success. So it's not as if we don't have the ability, it's a question of leadership. And that leadership definitely requires some new thinking and moving very rapidly. And I totally share Vida's reflection that the international community is mature and ready for Norwegian leadership. There is a very interesting alignment of the stars out there. The Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there is no doubt at all about the ability and willingness from the multilateral development banks. We've also, from science, had very interesting and constructive bilaterals with Ajay Banga, the incoming president of the World Bank. I'm having a discussion later today with Christine Lagarde of the European Investment Bank. There's such an alignment and interest in finding ways of mobilizing. And if Norway can now show the leadership, I think it won't be too difficult to see the alliances of the willing stepping up and joining forces on such a journey. So I can just wish Norway good luck and really hope that my fellows your neighbors in Stockholm will step up as well. I'll do everything I can to push as well. Thanks a lot.
When the Paris Agreement happened, it didn't just happen. It came from political leadership, but also, interestingly, from business leadership. And I think many politicians realized in the run-up to Paris that, hey, there's something happening in business. If they want to go there, we as politicians should lead. And key in that effort was the We Mean Business Coalition, led by Nigel Topping, who has, since he led the charge in mobilizing business behind the Paris Agreement, continued in this space. He's been a UN Climate Convention champion and is now working on capital mobilization. So Nigel, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vidar. Sometimes I have the impression that the whole conference is being done in English because I don't speak Norwegian. So thank you, everybody. Really, though, I want to start by thanking the groups who triggered the report and the committee and everyone involved in writing the report for taking such a holistic approach to the task. It was Mahmoud Mohidin, the Egyptian champion, and I who originally commissioned Nick Stern and Vera Songway to write a paper because we wanted to take an engineering approach, and instead of saying what should countries negotiate as a successor to the 100 billion, say what do we actually need to solve the problem, how much and where will it come from. So I'm delighted to see the Stern Songway Bhattacharya paper being used as a framing. That 2.4 trillion for emerging markets excluding China across, importantly, energy and industry, food, land and nature, and adaptation, resilience, loss and damage. So the whole package. We often hear numbers only about energy, and it's really important that we tackle the whole thing. But also showing that more than half of that, I actually think, not that emerging market countries can afford more than half of it, but that more than half of it will have to come from emerging markets. And that squarely 1 trillion of that will have to be from international public and private finance. And I think importantly, and Vidar, you've expressed that really well in your remarks, that it's not, the quantity of public finance is important, but more important is the leverage. Like, how much is the public finance mobilizing? How is it creating the conditions for private finance to flow at scale? Whether by helping create the right policy and capacity in countries that need it, supporting early stage project preparation, or changing the risk profile through the use of guarantees that Vidar explained. As Vidar said, I spent a lot of time trying to mobilize businesses in the last 3 years as the UN climate change champion. For those of you who don't know, that's a role created in the Paris Agreement by the countries who are the signatories to the agreement, saying we need a whole of society response, and we want some people to be responsible for working with the private sector, subnational governments and civil society to try and drive more ambition and momentum. So I think we have made a lot of progress in the last few years, but I've come to the end of my period thinking that we and I am really going to focus on two things. One is this potential for exponential change, which Johan talks about. We're finally starting to see people, I think, wake up and realize that. Fatih Birol in the FT recently talked about the fact that this transition is happening faster than we know. I'd encourage everyone to brush up on the exponential mathematics. It's actually a very predictable pattern of industrial transformation, based on a very well understood process of learning effects, Wright's law. And nearly all of the reports which project the pace of technology adoption don't take into consideration this well understood dynamic and these historical facts. So there is room for optimism in believing that it is possible for us to go much faster. I remember 5 or 6 years ago obsessing that the electric vehicle revolution was going to come by 2030 and being dismissed as a crazy man. Now everyone knows that the combustion engine is a dead technology, even though 5 years ago the IEA were talking about it prevailing until the 2070s. So there's a positive story there, but the other campaign that I'm committed to, as Vidar referred to, is the need to drive this 2.4 trillion of finance in emerging markets. at its bluntest, I think if we don't do that, then we face the conditions for fascism and global conflict. And I start to see in the narrative in DC a couple of weeks ago a recognition that if you look at what very small amounts of immigration have done to the politics in Europe and North America, imagine, if you dare, what much larger amounts will make. So I'll come back to, again, for the need for a kind of Marshall Plan mentality later. So we know we need this 2.4 trillion. We know it's urgent. We know there's not enough public, but even the public that is flowing isn't getting enough leverage. So I think that it's easier to describe this as just one big basket of problems. But the good news is we basically know what needs to be done. And we have many of the solutions, and we have more and more smart people who understand finance leaning in to solve the remaining problems. I think really importantly is a shift in narrative that we're seeing from the global south. Nick Stern's often said that addressing the climate crisis is the development story of the 21st century. And in DC a couple of weeks ago, we were meeting with ministers from Namibia, Egypt, Indonesia, Mauritania, all in different ways pursuing what President Ruto of Kenya is describing as climate positive development. So not recognizing that they have been and are on the receiving end of climate injustice, but not making that the defining dynamic or narrative, preferring to talk about their resilience, their entrepreneurship, the youth of their workforce, and their determination to get things done. And of course, there's a difference between that narrative, which is, I think, necessary, a positive one, if you want to attract investment, and maybe a slightly more grumpy narrative, which you might need in the negotiating context. But as I said to a group of Egyptian civil society leaders, the first time I met them in the run-up to COP27, after the fourth one of them had told me that the problem was the West not fulfilling the 100 billion promise, I said, I know, but imagine I'm the CEO of an international bank who's just come to Egypt for the first time to considering investing. I'd be on the way back to the airport by now. So this positive story of possibility, not just need, is one that I think is really important for us to develop to grab the attention of the allocators of capital. I also think this report highlights an amazing opportunity for Norway. Yes, to mobilise windfall royalties to demonstrate best-in-class solutions, and the power of demonstration is huge. There's a lot of herd behaviour in investment, and we know a lot of investors have, frankly, old-fashioned views of what the risk profile is in many emerging markets. I think there's also real synergy, Vidar, with the recommendations of the report and some of the messages we heard in this workshop around the climate capital acceleration in DC. Just to list some of the things that we heard from ministers and private sector alike. We need more money for project preparation, finance that's available to private sector, not just public sector. We need to scale up some of the things that work, like the Global Infrastructure Facility. We need to start aggregating projects into funds so that Global North pension funds can reach the minimum ticket size that they need in order to be able to invest. We need to support initiatives like the high-level champions and the United Nations Economic Commissions in lifting up pipelines. In the roundtables we held last year, we were kind of shocked, but maybe shouldn't have been, to quite often hear from the private sector, well, why do we not even know about these projects yet? You can't solve a problem for something that you don't have any visibility of. And I think if Franny was here, and I'm really sorry she couldn't join us, she would, of course, talk about the work she's led in terms of increasing the capital allocation in MDBs, but also, I think, speak from her perspective as an investor on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, and also chairing Financial Sector Deepening Africa, which does amazing work in supporting African countries with their policy framing and their capacity to absorb green finance. So I think that the guarantee mechanism is a particularly exciting one. We know that, and I think I really encourage all of you to listen to the more detailed presentations from the Blended Finance Task Force later. This 1 trillion, 1 billion to 30 billion leverage is quite extraordinary, and is based on having a better understanding of the risk profile and a smarter use of AAA rating sovereign balance sheets. And one point here that really came across to me last week, Hendrik du Toit of 91, which is one of the major investors in African infrastructure, made the point that global north investors are, and the rating agencies are generally exaggerating the risk. He talked about the very large infrastructure fund that they've been running for many years, which is generating good returns and hasn't had any loans go bad, which you wouldn't expect if you look at the way that credit ratings rate that kind of funds. So I think it's exciting to see the potential for Norway to be an accelerator of the global transition to a more sustainable, resilient and equitable economic system. And as I say, I think what we really need now is like a Marshall Plan for the 21st century, one which recognises this is a non-zero sum game, where our investment today can create a bigger, better, more inclusive economy from which we all benefit and prevent the creation of the circumstances which would lead to conflict. Those were the twin motivations: a growing economic pie which everyone benefits from, and the avoidance of conflict, which led the US to invest significantly in the restructuring of Europe after World War II. That was an act of courageous global leadership. We know that the US politics means that the US isn't in a position to give us that courageous global leadership now. So I think the report title is very pertinent, if not Norway Who. Mobilising your windfall profits will be key in terms of an extra quantum of finance, but mobilising Norway's political leadership will be even more important in addressing a far rarer resource need for political leadership, which I hope to see others joining soon, starting, as you suggest, with the UAE. Thank you.
So I'm here briefly to do two things. One is to inform you that they have opened an overflow room. So those of you who are either having pain in your legs or suffocating from poor air quality, feel free. Then I should thank three things, actually. Thank Nigel. Thanks. And then, thirdly, I'm going to hand over to Sigrun Aasland for the next round of comments and her able moderation. Sigrun is the CEO of Zero and also a member of the expert group.
Thank you, Vidar. And so good to see so many people here. My name is Sigrun, as Vidar said. We are going to invite some key stakeholders, some politicians, to hear what they have to say about the reports. First to Nigel, we're not speaking Norwegian because of you. We're speaking English because I think we all need to see ourselves from the outside, and that's part of the exercise. So it's just a healthy exercise for us, and I'm glad it's also convenient for you. The purpose of this report is to convince politicians that things need to be different. And we're going to talk to the politicians after. But we all know that one big challenge before we even get to the politicians is to get through to the staff of the Ministry of Finance. And so we have invited a former finance minister, now climate research leader, to join us in the panel. Please welcome Kristin Halvorsen. And it was said here that the business community tends to exaggerate risk and be a bit conservative. So we have also invited the impersonation of the progressive Norwegian business leaders. Ida Kreuzer, welcome to you. He has for many years been the president of the Finance Corporation in Norway, and he's now a director at the Norwegian Business Association. And last but not least, Elise Åsnes. She is the head of the youth organization Spire. Spire is a Norwegian environmental and development organization that works for a fair and sustainable world. And their mission is to see the big picture and change the fundamental reasons of why injustice occurs. So I think that's a perfect starting point for this discussion. And I want to get to the specific recommendations of the report, but just to start with the title, if not Norway, then who? Elisa, how do you think the rest of the world sees us at the moment, proud or not? And does Norway have a special responsibility? And if so, why?
Yeah, as a youth organization that wants to change the fundamental aspects of why the world is unjust, I think my answer here is not shocking. I believe that there's a lot of attention now about the double standards Norway has. We have earned money on fossil fuels and the energy situation we're in right now, and we're not taking responsibility for it. It has gotten to attention a couple of times last years. One example of that is at the Glasgow negotiations in the end of 2001 at the COP26, where Norway got the not so good award Fossil of the Day from International Civil Society. And now we also see that there's been a huge focus on how much money Norway is earning on the energy crisis we're in right now and not taking responsibility. So yeah, I think the world sees the double standards Norway has right now and the potential Norway has to take its historic responsibility.
Thank you. I want to continue to you, Ida. It was said, as I mentioned, that businesses in general tend to have overrate risk. There's a perceived risk out there, and there is a need for a lot of private capital to actually both mitigate and also adapt to climate changes. Why is it that the business community in general is so reluctant, and what can be done about that?
It's a big question, and of course it's not a general answer to that, and it business and finance in some contexts are seen as too willing to take on board risk, but it's what kind of risk, and what we have seen now is that the kind of risk that emerging markets and emerging economies represent is difficult for market players to access, and we need to understand why. There are a couple of the general problems is still out there about well-functioning markets, about liquidity, about rights to ownership. But I think we need to understand now, and Dagfinn said, if not now, when? I would argue that it's utmost urgent to find effective tools to address the situation right now. The reason being the fundamental change that we are experiencing in global monetary policies. We have behind us, after the financial crisis, 10, 12 years with what is called quantitative easing. Lowering of interest rates, increasing the supply of money. This has benefited emerging economies because the money has flowed out of the Western economies and into emerging economies looking for return. Now, to fight inflation, exactly the opposite is happening. Interest rates are increased and money supply is decreased. And as a consequence, money is pulled back actively, pulled back from emerging economies. And that happens exactly at the same time when we have price increases on energy, price increases on food, and we have an urgent need to close the financing gap, as IPCC says in the synthesis report. And we know that, it will be a lot of trouble out there with both politically and humanitarian problems, and we will not have the necessary acceleration of the energy transition. So it is utmost important that we come up with effective solutions right now. And if you're not into the fundamental needs, but you look at the geopolitical picture, it's easy to see that there's one guy out there with deep pockets utilizing this situation, and that is, of course, China. So if you're not motivated by all the other elements, but focus on the geopolitical situation, we need to mobilize, to be out there, and we need to have effective mechanisms. And to me, what is stated in this report is very interesting and needs to be read and taken into account from Norwegian politicians. We have an opportunity now.
Kristin, a lot of things about in the report is things that politicians need to do to de-risk, to invest more, to facilitate, to agree internationally, take leadership. What does it take to? It seems obvious to everyone here, of course, but what does it take to actually make politicians get over that tipping point and make things happen?
Well, I think that for many years we managed to combine a very good reputation when it comes to international climate negotiations and huge revenues from the oil and gas sector. And I think that has come to an end. I think it's not possible for Norway to keep these double standards, and we will be confronted from many parts of the world in the years to come. So I think that political will, that is something that was underlined, that is the most important thing. And I really think it is, of course, up to the civil society, up to all parties represented in the parliament, but it's mainly up to the government, because it's very hard to force a government without ambitions to step up. So I really hope that this report will challenge all of us to step up and to be more engaged, and but also that it will inspire the Norwegian government, because we can't deal with international climate negotiations from the opposition in the parliament, or from science, or from this. Well, the civil society has a big role to play, but I think this is mainly a report that challenges, of course, all parties, but mainly the government.
And how do you inspire governments?
How do we inspire government? Because you really need that extra ambition to make it fly, or you can't do that with your left hand. You have to do it with all your limbs.
Ida, any proposals?
But seen from the government's point of view, I think they should be concerned about two things. One is we need this. We need this for the sake of the people and the emerging economies, but we also need it for the sake of stable economic development and political development globally. So that's point number one. But the other part of it, government should be concerned about the effectiveness of government money, the impact of what government does. And what this report does is to point at very effective mechanisms that can increase impact of government money significantly. And what you should look at is the term multiplier. If you spend $1 on direct aid, you get $1 of direct aid back. If you spend $1 in this kind of mechanisms, you can get $30 of aid back. Well, let's think about that. So government should look at the needs, but also look at the impact. And both reasons should mobilize and motivate government to have a close look at this.
Elise, I know you're impatient, and there are many reports out there about climate and climate finance. Do we need another report? and what is the main added value of this report, in your view?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of reports, but this was really good, so I'm happy for it. And just to comment on the discussion over here, how do we convince the government? I think civil society is, of course, a very important actor there, both in Norway and internationally. But yeah, this report, I think it's good, and it's a very, very good initiative, and I think it's good to sort of be more in front. There's a lot of things happening right now, just for the civil society to also be in front and have some clear demands is very, very important. And I think the most important aspects of the report, which is vital to emphasize, is the fundamental principles in the beginning of it. Because we see today that there's a lot of climate finance is vital, but it's also vital to have human rights and debt in the center of it, and inclusion. Because otherwise it can also have negative effects. So it's really just important to emphasize the importance of the fundamental principles this report so clearly focuses on in the beginning. Human rights has to be in the center of it, and I'm therefore very glad that this report points to that so clearly.
Christine, what's your favorite proposal in the report, and what's your least favorite?
I have actually 4 points. I think it is very useful and important that all these proposals may be implemented without violating the fiscal policy guideline. That makes it feasible. So 1 point for that. I really liked the initiative to mobilize green guarantees. That is the most important part when it comes to mobilize private capital, and public capital can't solve all these problems on their own. And there is private capital there, so if we find the good balance, that will work. And I think it's wise to establish a separate fund to invest in renewable energy and BIM renewable, because you need a different risk mechanism to do that kind of investments, and you shouldn't put all the goals you have into the sovereign wealth fund. So that is a very important part of it. And then my 4th point is that it is essential to be honest when it comes to the risk profile. Not underestimate the risk of loss. We will have losses, of course. There will be some failures, and we need to have some understanding for coming losses too. So I think this report is feasible. It's within reach to introduce these kind of measures in the global climate discussion. And if we are looking for a person to advocate for it, maybe Jens is available in a short time. Could be something. He was very, when Regnskogfondet and Naturvernforbundet, I'm sorry, I don't remember the English names for it, they took this initiative when it comes to deforestation and the RED initiative. And Jens was very eager on that and has, invested a lot of efforts into that work. So maybe it could be a new...
That's a nice bridge from the amount of money we spend on the war economy and what we need
exactly.
for climate finance.
He's used to large numbers. Yes.
Important qualification. Ida, what is your main takeaway or favorite suggestion? And is there something you do not like in the report?
The last suggestion should have been in the report. I mean, Jens is looking for a job, and he has shown an ability to mobilize. So, but 2 or 3 things. It's a no-brainer that we need to mobilize private finance, the financial markets. But it's very important that it's stressed so clearly in the report. I mean, we struggle as a global community to mobilize 100 billion, and we need 2,400 billion a year. So public money won't do it. We need to mobilize private finance and work together with the market. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, it's very, very important that in the report it stresses that time is of the essence, and it's much more effective to build on existing mechanisms and existing institutions instead of developing new mechanisms. Everybody that has tried know that it takes you 5 to 10 years before anything new will be effective. We do not have 5 to 10 years. So to find the mechanisms that we can utilize existing institutions and existing mechanisms is extremely important. And the 2 mechanisms that's just in front of us is to develop a guarantee mechanism along the lines that is described here. It's very effective, and what we effectively do is that Vidar said that to a country like Norway, we will for a project pay 4%. In an emerging economy, they will pay 12% for the same project. So profitable projects will not get financing due to lack of rating. We have a AAA rated country. We can lend over rating to emerging economies, and suddenly a lot of projects will get financing at terms that makes the projects profitable. It's a very important mechanism to understand and to utilize. And it can be done relatively quickly. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, Norfund is an expert investor. Somewhat overlooked in the Norwegian context, not in Africa. They know Norfund. They are good, doing a fantastic job. The climate fund was a breakthrough that can be increased and leveraged easily. The number of projects is available. So I really like that one too. And I would also like to say that the first mover mechanism is important. And Norway has a lot of resources. With a lot of resources comes a lot of responsibility, and we should take that responsibility. And I can share with you that Norfund, Norad, Innovation Norway, Finance Norway, and NHO, we have spent over the last year, we have discussed different mechanisms for blended finance. Paul Wade and the excellent work you did in Norfund in Norad is a part of the framework, but we are prepared to support the work going forward, to operationalize this and see how this can be done in a way that can work effectively, quickly.
Thank you. Final quick comment from Spire.
Yeah, regarding the report, I also believe that Norway has to put strict requirements for human rights in both our funds here in Norway, and also regarding what type of funds we're giving to. I think it's vital to put the Global South here in center of what they want, what they need, because we see that in the UN climate negotiation, for example, there's a lot of discussions on what kind of funds we need, but we need to listen to the ones being affected by the losses and damage of it. And also, I think an important aspect which I want to highlight here is viewing, in addition to the recommendations in this report, we also have to view the civil society as an actor in itself, both in projects, but also in developing these initiatives. And I think that also has to be a fundamental principle within this. And just to finish here, and a very vital aspect of this report is the distinguishing between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And this is a very clear thing. I think the Norwegian government has to also distinguish better with when we talk about climate finance, because today we see that these are just combined and together, and it's very, as the report very thoroughly shows, it's very different on how we can approach this. And of course, loss and damage has to be grants from the government.
Kristin, Idar, and Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. And it was said that the government is the most important part, and we're going to hear from the government towards the end. But I'm very happy first now to welcome two of the most vocal and knowledgeable opposition politicians on this topic. Nikolai Astrup is a former Minister of Development. He is a parliamentarian for the Conservative Party. Please welcome Nikolai. And Kari Elisabeth Kaski, where are you? You're here. She holds the key to any budget agreement at the moment, and also is a very vocal voice on climate issues and finance. So welcome to you, Kari Elisabeth. I want to start with one of the main propositions here, Nikolai. Does Norway have a bigger responsibility than others in this area?
Well, at least I do. We do have a responsibility, as Ida said. We are a wealthy country. With that comes big responsibility, but also we have a great opportunity to contribute. And I think that is important, of course, for the world, but it's also going to be important for Norway. So for those who are not convinced by idealism, there is also a matter of self-interest. I think we need both going forward.
Kari Elisabeth, obvious question perhaps, but should we expect more from Norway than other countries in this topic?
I think it's difficult in a way to sort of go into this discussion by that on that question, because you have to look at Norway in itself, I think, and not compare ourselves necessarily to other countries. We have at the moment an enormous extraordinary income due to the high costs of energy, of oil and gas. That leads to a particular responsibility at the moment. We also have a historic responsibility being a rich country from oil and gas, which has contributed to the climate change that we are experiencing. So we obviously have a big responsibility, and it doesn't, in a way, we have to go forward and we have to be leading, and we are not leading at the moment, I think, in many of these areas that the report is touching upon.
But you said, Nikolai, that we have a special opportunity. Does the oil revenue also give us a special responsibility? Is it, we're responsible for emissions historically? Does that add?
Well, yes, I think the answer to that is yes, but I also want to say that, I mean, we do a lot in Norway. We are global leaders in many areas. So the question is, what can we do more of? ODA is under pressure in most of the world, and with the war in Ukraine and high energy costs, inflation, it's not going to be easier going forward. So I think the obvious solution is what the report is pointing to, that we need to mobilize private capital at a pace and scale that we've never seen before. The cost of capital is too high, the regulatory risks are too many, the political risks are too high, and we need to leverage our ODA to its fullest extent to make sure that we de-risk investments. And also, I think the report also points to some important points on the development banks. Now, my experience as Minister of International Development was that business is very frustrated with the banks. They're very conservative. They're not first in with their capital, they're last in. And accessing this capital is very difficult. Now, the World Bank has never lost money, ever. So that says something about the risk profile that they have chosen to take. And the same goes for the other banks. So there is a need to overhaul that whole system, making sure that our different instruments work better together. Because now we're too often, we're all having, there are lots of great initiatives around the world. They're not talking to each other. So that needs to happen. And what they point to on guarantees, I think, is absolutely crucial. Now, there's a lot of talk about the trillions that we need. I prefer to talk about the trillions that we need for the SDGs, because let's be honest, we can't talk about climate finance like it's a separate issue from all the other development issues in the world. We need to have a holistic approach, because reaching SDG 13 on climate means that we need progress on the other SDGs as well. If we don't have progress on those SDGs, then we're not going to reach number 13 either. So this, it all comes together. And then let me also say that we need, of course, the big companies investing, and they do to some extent. But the SMEs, I mean, this market is completely closed off. And just look at the anti-money laundering directives in Europe, which are very well, founded, and we should have them. But it also means that if you're an SME wanting to invest in Africa, there's an immediate red flag. If I call my bank and say, I want to invest 1 million crowns in a business in Ghana, they're going to say, good luck, but we're not going to support you. We're not going to transfer your money. And if you make a profit, we're not going to take it back. And this is a huge issue. So we need to look at the whole system that we have. It needs to be more focused on how we can leverage private investments in Africa, India, emerging markets. And the potential is huge. If we do this right, the potential is huge. In terms of saving the climate, in terms of reaching more SDGs, but not least, it's huge also in terms of the market opportunity that this unlocks. And that is going to be a major driver for private investment. And we need to communicate that to businesses more clearly than we do, and make sure that they have these guarantees and concessional loans to actually make it happen.
I want to get into the specifics of the report, Kari Elisabeth. What is your favorite, or is there anything here that you will work on going forward?
So I think that everything here is something that we can draw upon when we go into, for example, the budget negotiations with the government. But I also hope that the government, particularly, takes this report to themselves, because that's the main, would say. I think the main challenge here is that it's difficult to sort of, from the parliament, try to make or create new mechanisms or new ways of let the finance flow to, for example, Africa, as Nikolai here states, that a lot of this has to be work from the government as well. So we have great expectations for the government and for the coming budget.
And if they come with one of these 4 suggestions, what will be will they get your support?
Yeah, I think so. That most of this is something that we will support and also push forward, and a lot of this is something that we are already discussing. For example, the Climate Investment Fund. How can we both increase the finance of the Climate Investment Fund, but also the discussion of whether it's not going to be a part of the development aid and the 1%. And I think that this report is pragmatic in its approach to that, and that perhaps helps to reach an agreement on that, because that would be helpful for us. And also, at the moment, the Standing Committee on Finance is debating the sovereign wealth fund, the pension fund, and I think that we've sort of reached a place now that we think that the sovereign wealth fund is sort of, we're all set. We're done with trying to make it better or greener, and sort of closed a lot of the discussions on climate and the sovereign wealth fund. This is interesting what comes here. I'm not sure if I personally agree with making sort of a new fund within the sovereign wealth fund. I think that we already have a lot of mechanisms, and it's also important what the sovereign wealth fund does for itself, and how, for example, the climate goal for the sovereign wealth fund is formulated. And right now it's not very clear. We're investing in companies that takes us to 2.4 degrees of global warming. That's not good enough. And we can rather use the climate investment fund and other mechanisms that we already have instead of trying to create a new one.
Nikolai, what about you? NBIM renewable or not?
Well, I mean, I got this report today, so I'm not going to be conclusive on everything, but I'm a bit surprised that they proposed this. And the reason, 2 reasons. One is that Vidar is a very astute politician, so he knows that it's extremely difficult to convince the Ministry of Finance about anything, especially when it comes to NBIM. The second is what Idar pointed to, which is that it takes time. And making this a new fund in the fund is going to take time. It's not set up for it, as it doesn't have the competence to run it. It requires a completely different model of running this fund. And then we have 2 excellent other options, which is Norfund and the Climate Investment Fund, and they're together in a sense. And it's feasible to raise more capital through NBIM as well. I mean, you could have more of an indirect approach with sort of a fund-in-fund structure where NBIM has a mandate for unlisted infrastructure, and what goes on in the developed markets they handle themselves, and developing markets they sort of invest in Norfund or the Climate Investment Fund. That's a possibility, I guess. Again, I haven't concluded on anything, but I think we need to think more how to sharpen our instruments that we have rather than create new ones.
Kari Elisabeth, was it to the Climate Investment Fund you wanted to comment? Or
no, actually, it was just on that note that my view is that the NBIM is continually trying they're sort of searching in how can they move now, how can they invest in this new area, in this new era of climate and new climate goals, and they're trying to look for projects. We have opened up where they can invest in renewable infrastructure. They haven't found the right projects yet, so they're sort of searching in a way. So I think that's a challenge back to you guys and the organizations behind this report, more concrete
advices for us, the politicians, and also for MBIM itself, without like trying to create all these kind of new funds, but within the fund today, what should they do? And I think we're sort of looking for new ways within the fund that we already have and the setup that we have.
Any comments on the Norwegian initiative for guarantees, Nikolai?
Well, I think that sounds like a very interesting idea that we will definitely consider. And as I said, I think guarantees is probably the most efficient way of de-risking investments in developing countries. So this is definitely something we should look at how we can do in the most efficient way. And of course, Norway needs to bring along others. I mean, this is not something that we can do alone. And again, we need to see that together with the work that the banks are already doing internationally, the development banks. But judging from the past, I think maybe it needs to be something separate from the banks, but in coordination with the banks.
Kari Elisabeth, what about the guarantee fund or guarantee initiative?
Well, it's new for us as well. I mean, we've from SV's point of view always wanted to sort of strengthen the guarantees that Norway can give in order also to mobilize more private capital. So, but this is a new initiative. We're going to discuss it, and I think it's interesting to see if we can move forward on it.
You mentioned, I think, Kari Elisabeth, there are many things happening now. There's you're going to be discussing in Parliament the Sovereign Wealth Fund this spring. There are meetings on climate finance in Paris. There are annual meetings in the World Bank. There's the COP28 in Dubai. What would you, if you were the government, what would you bring along to those meetings as a commitment and as a contribution? Kari Elisabeth first.
More money.
And more specifically.
No, but I think that's important. Just to sort of we don't have to make this too complicated. Also, because it's also a question about prioritizing and to actually want to prioritize more money to invest in more renewable energy, but also to adapt to the climate change that's already happening, which is also a very important part of this. And I think that we should look at how much money we could spend. It's interesting what this report says about the financial guidelines, the handlingsregel, because I think it was the previous panel here who stated that it's a very good thing that the report says that we can be within the financial guidelines that we already have. But the thing is that that's continuously up for debate whether or not it's within the financial guidelines. I've been debating that a lot with the government. But now we sort of reached this new phase where we agree that we can spend more money internationally without breaking the financial guidelines. It's important and something we need to sort of cling on to and also see that in the light of climate finance, I think, forward. But another part of this is that we have this extraordinary high income right now from the oil and gas. Both the oil and gas itself into the sovereign wealth fund, but also the oil and gas companies in Norway. And both get a windfall tax, which have been in place in other countries, and to see whether or not we can use the income from that windfall tax to take the extraordinary profits to spend on developing climate technology, for example, offshore wind in Norway, is interesting, but also spend it on climate finance internationally is something that we should bring to the table, I think, internationally.
Nikolai.
Well, I went to the COP in Egypt, and of course financing was the major issue. And at the same time, we had European countries cutting back on their own budgets, the war in Ukraine, high energy costs. And you need to have, this is why you need the private capital on board, because it's going to be extremely difficult to mobilize public funding from Norway. Yes, it's possible, but from the rest of Europe, I mean, France hasn't balanced its budget since 1974, and they're a rich country in Europe. And Italy even worse, Spain the same. So it's going to be difficult to get public approval in this time of rising living costs to prioritize differently, I think. So that's why private capital is going to be key. And then the other thing is, going into the next COP, it's important that all these pledges from countries are not just a repackaging of old pledges and then selling it as a new big thing when you already pledged that money many times before. This is a well-known trick, of course, in all the ministries of finance and foreign affairs around the world. But that needs to stop. I mean, it needs to be real change in the approach to this. So it needs to be fresh money, and we really need to look at the multiplier effect. Now, one of my favorite examples is the tax program that we have in Norge, where $1 spent by us gives a $100 return in the receiving country, and that's the kind of multiplier effect you need to see. So 1 to 30 in guarantees is very good. 1 to 100 is even better. But 1 to 1, well, the irony maybe, and this is a bombshell in this crowd, of course, is that many of the NGOs, they have a 1 to 1 in their aid efforts. So I'm just going to leave that with you. You can think about that and see how you also, as NGOs, can help build that multiplier effect. Because it's not only governments, it's not only financial institutions, it's not only the business community that needs to think about the multiplier effect. Also the NGOs need to think more about that going forward.
Kari Elisabeth, you said she needs to bring more money to the COP, for example. In what way are you going to help her do that in the budget process? What's going to be your priority?
SV can't take the responsibility of preserving Norway's role as a global leader on climate finance or on development aid. That's the responsibility of the government. And I think they know that they are going to get the majority with us if they come to the parliament with a budget that actually shows that we're committed to the 1% rule for the development aid. And I stress that point because we spent a lot of time this fall increasing or trying to increase the budget, both last year, last spring and this fall, increasing our development aid, which is important also in this context because of, for example, the war in Ukraine has increased the energy prices, the cost of living and food in many countries, but also trying to move more money for both climate finance project, but also, as I mentioned, that we need to adapt to the climate change that's already happening. And that's also an important point for us, that we should spend more money on adapting also. That's often been seen from both environmental organizations and other NGOs as sort of that we are accepting that the climate change is happening, or that's sort of, it's a defeat, but it's necessary. And it's also necessary if you're going to accept that Norway has a historic responsibility as well as an oil-producing country.
Nikolai.
Well, just one thing that worries me a bit is that we're now facing, I think, the biggest setback for globalization in the last 30 years. We're seeing increased regionalization of trade, more protectionism, more subsidies, more nationalism, and in a world where we need not only to mobilize traditional donors, but also the new emerging donors, like China, like India, like Mexico, whatever, Brazil, that is going to be a problem. And we see now already that India has put on a 40% tariff on solar panels from China, trying to build up a big solar industry. What we know about this is that it's going to be more expensive for the world to go through a green transition. And that's actually a barrier. In a time where we need more than ever that capital is flowing freely across borders, also into the developing countries, my fear is that it is the developing countries who are going to be on the losing end if this trend continues to grow in force. And the Western countries are not helping with our policies now, which are slightly in breach of WTO agreements and sort of on the. So there's a lot of things to worry about on this, of course. But in mobilizing capital, we don't need a big setback for globalization to achieve that.
I want to ask you too about the budget, though, before we wrap up. What would you, well, one thing is the aid budget that Kari Elisabeth mentioned, where I think you agree in principle. There are also some proposals in this report that go beyond the 1% ODA. What will you work for or prioritize of these things in the budget process and towards global meetings? Is it the climate investment fund that your government put in place? Is it a guarantee system? Is there any other way of using public funds to mobilize the private capital that you want in the budget process?
Well, I think it's premature for me to promise anything on this, actually, because I'm not in the finance committee and I'm not actually on the standing committee on foreign affairs either. So, but my point is that we need to focus on the innovative mechanisms. That's going to be key, and more important than if it's 40 or 41 billion that goes to aid through our budget is how we actually spend it, and that goes on all areas, not only climate. We need exponential curves where we have seen linear curves in the past. We need radical change, and that requires innovative thinking around all our whole aid budget and how we get the most of it. Because we need to make sure that developing countries can leapfrog many of the steps that we have walked on our way to becoming developed countries. But we will definitely read this with great interest, and I will give my views on this to the relevant people in my party and make sure that they do the innovative thinking and then that we get a good result. And hopefully also a result that we can agree on across parties, because this is something that we need to stay the course over time. We can't change our development policy from one year to another. We need to sort of make sure that the long, especially if we involve NBIM, that the long lines are that we are in agreement across party lines.
Final quick comment, Kai.
Yeah, on the last part on NBIM, I completely agree, and I think that actually when you've seen how NBIM has developed over the past, or the structures for NBIM have developed over the past 10 years, it's been from the parliament and also from the NGOs that sort of pushed NBIM forward. Now I fear that we are sort of having a pause in that. So again, to just repeat myself, I think we need a new push on the development of NBIM, and that we're perhaps will be able to agree across party lines also in the parliament on that.
Kari Elisabeth Kaski, Nikolai Astrup, thank you so much. I think you will both be hearing from the organizations and the members, and we've heard a lot about who's responsible and who needs to take all these suggestions and put them into action. And so I'm very pleased to welcome the Deputy Minister of Development, Bjørg Sandkjær, up to the stage.
Thank you, Vidar, and thank you to the humanitarian organizations who brought us all here. And not least thanks to the expert group who have provided us with a very interesting document that I look forward to taking back and studying. There was a comment here about having this conference in English, although we are in Oslo. I think there might be other reasons than you being here, Nigel. One other reason, not just that we need to see ourselves from the outside, but that others are looking at us from outside. So I just came, I realized others might have also been at the World Bank spring meetings just 1.5 weeks ago. There's a lot of discussion around the kinds of themes and topics that have come up here already. How traditional development assistance is under pressure. And either way, all the combined development assistance of the world doesn't even take us close to getting to bridge the financing gaps, neither in climate nor in the sustainable development goals in general. And so we have to be creative. We have to look at how we can spend the development assistance that we do have as effectively as possible. But how do we also link in all the different sectors that have been here today? We've heard from the private sector. I myself have learned a lot about banking and de-risking and different financial instruments. Thankfully, we have very good people in the ministry who knew this already. So good thinking have gone into how can we apply the tools that we have, be it on de-risking investments, be it on the too high cost of capital, be it in other areas. Because we do know that financing the right solutions may not be straightforward. They do involve tools that can be technically and financially complicated. So thanks for this report that helps us to see how we can move forward, how we need to work with civil society, with high-level experts to start this constructive dialogue at home. And it makes me very hopeful for the future. So these discussions are happening in many different places. And you may know also that from the part of the government, we have asked an independent expert group to give us some advice on how we best structure our development assistance. Climate will, of course, be an important part of that. We will be receiving the report from this expert group on the 15th of May. So, of course, we will take the report that we got today. We will take the recommendations from the expert group. We will take inputs that we are getting from our colleagues in the Global South, from the private sector and from civil society, to really think through how we can step up our efforts in this area. We have committed to doubling the financing for climate within our development budgets from 7 billion to 14 billion by 2025. Within that, we have said that we are going to triple support for adaptation. That means we can look at, for example, better ways to improve food production in the face of the climate crisis. But we also need other tools and other approaches that will get us to that. We heard about exponential. I'll brush up on my exponential maths to get us to where we want to be. So that's what I just wanted to say today. Again, very, very big thanks. Thanks for good recommendations. We will take them back. We will study them. We will be talking to to the actors represented in this room to see how we can figure out how we can translate some of this into practice. Thanks.
And thank you, State Secretary, for coming. Obviously, this is not a report that we're to hand over to you, but we did that anyway, and we're very happy that you could come. Very happy that we've seen other politicians coming, and I see an alignment in the making about the need for mobilizing more private finance, not the least. And thank you, all of you, for being here. Feel free to hang around for a few more minutes, but I do understand it if you would like to go out for some fresh air. All the best.